All right, welcome everyone to this BRSL webinar. I'm Vivian. I'm in communications at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. I just want to welcome you all and go over a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So the first thing is, if you have any questions for the panelists during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And then if you see anything that you're also interested in that someone else has already said, you can also use the upvote function in that Q&A box as well. We're recording the webinar and it will be available after the webinar finishes on our website. That's the BRSL website, and then also on our YouTube channel. So you can check it out there. And now I'm going to pass it over to Leah to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Vivian, and thank you to all of you who are joining us this morning. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists, John Metzler, who's a continuing lecturer at the Haas School of Business and who's a faculty fellow at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. We're also joined by Professor Andrew Reddie, who's the faculty director of the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab and who, like the lab, is at the Goldman School for Public Policy. I'm Leah Walker. I'm the executive director at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab, and I'm quite excited to talk to these two about their latest article in War on the Rocks, The Double Power Law, How American Innovation Really Works. This is quite a timely topic because we're going to be talking about the role that universities play in the US innovation ecosystem, the role that universities play in US competitiveness, and that conversation, of course, will bring us into topics of technology research and development, the role of governments and other funding sources for basic and applied technology research, and how all of that is playing out in the current environment. So thank you, John and Andrew, for joining us today. And I want to kick it off by sending the question over to you, John, and asking you to walk us through the double power law concept that you highlight so well in your article. What does it mean? And why did you decide to use it to explain the success of the American innovation system?
All right. Well, first, thanks for having. I'm John Metzler, continuing lecturer at the Haas School of Business. I am what this Haas School of Business refers to as, quote, professional faculty, which is kind of a funny term, but basically it refers to practitioners who come in from industry, and probably half the business school faculty kind of fall in that category. So people who are in industry working on some given topic and then came back and started teaching. So I'm in that topic. It's been a delight to join BRSL as faculty fellow and also sit on your advisory board. So first, thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this. And now the topic. So Andrew and I were talking over coffee, as one does. And in my course, Opportunity Recognition, I use a book called The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. It's behind me on the printer there for those who are looking at what's behind me. And it's a term you hear a lot to describe Silicon Valley. A venture capital fund may have a power law distribution in terms of its returns. If a fund invests in 30 companies, maybe 10% of those are hits. The returns kind of exhibit the power law distribution. The same dynamic applies when you're talking about the overall, say, venture capital industry. There was a power law distribution of return to LPs. Some funds do better than others, right? So we were talking about that, but as we got to talking, we were reminded that venture capital tends to amplify strands of research or innovation that have been kickstarted somewhere else. And that got us to, well, what's upstream from venture capital? And that really gets into research. And that too exhibits a power law distribution where you have a lot of different research strands being conducted by different researchers in different places and different topics. There, you can almost visualize it as a quilt or a mosaic. But there's a power law of returns in terms of one strand may become mRNA, one strand may eventually peter out, never cross the valley of death. So you really have two power law ecosystems at work. The downstream venture capital ecosystem, which amplifies research strands, turns those into companies, scales, commercializes, et cetera. We're very familiar with that. That's very well covered. Maybe what's less well covered and could use a little bit more covering going forward is the upstream research ecosystem. So that's what got us to talking, got us to writing, and boom, next thing you know, we had an article. So hopefully that helps explain.
That's excellent. Thank you. And, Andrew, I'd love to hear from you how you think about the role that research universities play in those early stages of the innovation pipeline and how you've seen Berkeley and other universities enable that downstream commercialization.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of build off of John's point there, like this conversation that we were having over coffee happens inside of an environment where we're going through a pretty significant recalibration in terms of how to be thinking about um, basic research funding from universities via mechanisms like the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, DARPA, DoD, et cetera. And so really that was kind of the catalyst kind of thinking about this space. And it's something of an oversimplification to think about, basic research from the universities kind of operating at technology readiness levels, say 1 through 3. So just to back up for a second, one of the ways that we kind of describe the distribution of technological innovation is inside of what we describe as technology readiness levels, where kind of TRLs 1 through 3 are really, really basic. 4 to 6 is when you're starting to get a product that's kind of prototyping, heading towards market. And then your 7 through 9 is really when you're starting to actually, produce the first widget that will actually go to market and eventually hopefully scale. And that's what obviously the VCs are kind of chasing after. And so kind of one of the ways to think about this space is that universities are operating really on this basic side as you try to get to applied side and move up these technology readiness levels. And they're a part of an ecosystem alongside various other entities, for example, the national laboratories and other FFRDCs who are playing a role kind of at that TRL 4 through 6. And then you've got your venture capital firms that are coming in towards the end of that cycle, TRL 6, 7, right, that are getting ready to actually pump a product to market. And so each type of entity has a role to play in the innovation economy. And as John ably points out, we've tended to laud one part of that story. And so I think one of the things that John and I are trying to do is to shine a spotlight on a part of the story that is often ignored, which is really that kind of basic research, type 61 type funding that we relied on to make relatively major innovative breakthroughs over the course of the last, what is it now, almost 60 years, 70 years since Vannevar Bush's Endless Frontier. So, I think that that's really kind of the impetus behind the paper and also the continuing work in this space too.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of those basic research successes that have turned into those products that we know so well, they weren't necessarily very targeted funding pushes. And so there's this sort of decentralized nature to the US research funding ecosystem that has really contributed to innovation. It's a lot of small bets and things have broken through, but they haven't necessarily been a really tailored focus from the beginning. And we're seeing a change now. We're seeing, particularly in the previous administration, we saw some very targeted efforts for R&D funding, particularly the CHIPS Act, which
Yep.
has, a more complicated legacy these days than it did maybe 2 years ago. So, John, first to you and then to Andrew, how do you think about these new efforts as the US government is increasingly comfortable with industrial policy and recognizes that there are all of these key technologies that are critical to US competition? Those technologies are coming from basic research at US universities, and there's increasingly pots of monies or initiatives that are tailored to specific technologies and potential outputs. How does that change this ecosystem, and what sort of risks are we seeing there?
There's a lot of great examples of success cases that come out of concentrating the spigot, right? Whether you're talking about the Apollo mission or whether you're talking about Operation Warp Speed,
Hmm.
when the federal government really turns on the resources, says, we're going to do this, you can really do things at massive scale. And so the idea of concentrating resources on a given problem is not new, and it can really have profound value in a lot of different ways. And I guess I might frame that to think you want to have, it's not an either or, you want both,
Hmm.
which is to say the concentration of research into a given topic area when there's recognition that's a national problem or a national priority presumably amplifies something that's already there. So it doesn't necessarily come necessarily as a substitute to distributed, more fragmented, earlier stage research. It takes strands that had existed and amplifies them towards a problem. Now, in your framing for the question, there was an interesting dynamic, which is the time domain, right?
Hmm.
Putting someone in space, going from mRNA strand to vaccines that are in people's arms, right? All over the country is not a 1 year problem. It's not a 3 year problem. It's not those priorities take time going from strand to product. And so there's a time domain question, right? Embedded in like for how long do you want to continue the priority? Do those priorities survive from administration to administration? CHIPS Act is probably a little bit loaded. It'll be hard to evaluate the legacy because there's been discontinuity in how we deliver, right, that particular kind of concentration of research.
Yeah, and
But
I
I guess
think
I would frame it as it's a both rather than either or.
no, I think that's completely fair, and I think it's also how you structure the strategic bet, right?
Hmm.
Because CHIPS Act was a situation where there was a lot of money put into the ecosystem, but I was, and you and I have had these conversations. I was a little concerned when it came out about lots of money structured,
Hmm.
maybe a little bit less structuring on coordination within the ecosystem and tracking
Sure.
metrics. And, that might seem bureaucratic to some, but it is important to know that you're not necessarily duplicating efforts, that there's general consensus in the field that, of the wide array of research questions we could be exploring, here are the top ones of concerns. Here are the ones that we've sort of explored and they've petered out. I
Hmm.
do think we've learned from those previous examples during the Cold War that does need to be some sort of direction. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I agree. And this is one of the things Andrew and I debated with the article is to what degree did we want to separate kind of distributed research versus administration to administration priorities? And
Yeah.
administrations have the right to have priorities, whatever they are, right? And to concentrate resources on this, but it's rather kind of separating the early stage research in support of that from whatever the priority is, and acknowledging that administration priorities probably often aren't solvable in 4 years, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's onshoring semiconductor supply chains or it's funding research in a given vaccine strand, uh, how do you get those priorities to survive? How do you get research to survive over 8-year, 10-year, 12-year, 15-year spans, which is often required when you're going from idea to product?
Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew, I would ask for your thoughts on that, but I will add to that that sort of institutional autonomy to allow for that ecosystem of basic research gets quite challenging when you look at an environment like the one we're in, where there are significant funding pressures on universities.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's so kind of two different strands here. I mean, one is to point out that some of the strategic initiatives and efforts ended up building upon parts of science and engineering that were continued and sustained by PIs and academics for a long time, more or less in a winter. So, for example, Operation Warp Speed built upon a lot of work and scholarship going back to the 1990s on mRNA vaccines, right? And all of a sudden, right, we started dumping lots of money and time right into that particular technology, given the problem that we were facing. And so, again, you had a strategic initiative leveraging some of that basic research that had taken part for a long time. Another example that's obviously very salient to us here at Berkeley is the AI winter. And so allowing our researchers in CS to plow along for a period in which, for example, AI research didn't get a lot of money, all else equal. And now, obviously, is ballooning and is a strategic initiative of the current administration, right? Looking at things like the AI action plan. So that's kind of the first point. You've got even the strategic initiatives are often building off of kind of basic science, low TRL levels. And then the second piece is really getting to your second question there, Leah, around kind of the importance of effectively allowing for some amount of failure. I mean, so like we said, this is one of the reasons I really like thinking about the power law distribution inside of the basic research space in the university and FFRDC space, because allowing PIs to take on creative projects that might not work end up yielding all sorts of new products and technologies that maybe weren't initially actually asked for inside of the funding vehicle, whether it be NIH or NSF or what have you. And so, to some extent, you've got, right, these major research universities with hundreds of thousands of faculty, all of whom are getting to kind of plow, right, funding, time, energy, graduate student labor, postdoctoral labor, right, against their kind of problem set. And every once in a while, you'll end up yielding, right, a technology that's ripe for these types of strategic initiatives, like the mRNA technology. And so I think that's the kind of story that I worry about in terms of thinking about changing the mechanism instead of kind of broad-based funding and then seeing all of the various different advances across aerospace, AI, biotech. And rather than saying, right, like we as a country are going to focus on one technology vertical, Indeed, I think one of the things that we don't write about enough is the degree to which the broad characteristic of our R&D funding contributes to our national power, such as it is on the international stage, in a way that is maybe different than other countries who get to focus on one particular industry, whether it be Taiwan in semiconductors or the United Kingdom in aerospace. And I also worry that if you're putting it entirely in the hands of policymakers to make strategic bets on particular technology verticals, maybe they're not always going to get it right. I mean, John knows this better than I do around METI and MITI in the Japanese case. They obviously were very successful, but you have all sorts of other examples where countries have made effectively bad bets on technology, going back to import substitution industrialization in Latin America, for example. And so, I think one of the things that concerns me about going entirely in the strategic priorities, strategic initiatives direction is that we might get it wrong and we're not going to know that until the ship has sailed.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's also countries who have made, good bets that in the long run, had their time limits. I'm old enough to
Yeah,
remember when we had Minitel in France, and
exactly. Yeah,
that
yeah,
was a really good bet for the end of the 20th century.
yeah.
I don't think any of those are around anymore, and they are certainly not hooked up. John, do you want to talk a bit about that Meta case study? Because that's something that you're quite familiar with, and it ties into some of the other work that you're doing with us at the lab on semiconductor onshoring.
Yeah, so just for the benefit of the audience, I'm actually also a faculty fellow at BRSL. I am looking at Japan's reinvestment in semiconductor industry now, and one of the key stakeholders within that is METI, and I believe someone from METI is on the call. So thanks for joining. Um, and they're a key stakeholder driving policy and helping kind of Japan reshore
Yeah.
or amplify some of the research strands that are already exist. So METI is actually going through a very similar exercise, but Medi as an institution has a lot of institutional memory, right? Practice with kind of industrial policy. Some of them have been successful, some of them have been less successful for various reasons, but it actually has a lot of muscle memory that it can bring to bear when it says, well, we want to kind of bring academia and industry together and point and steward in a certain direction. So I would point them to them as a case study that hasn't always borne fruit, but some have. And right now, Japan's onshoring of semi seems to be going pretty well.
Great, thank you. And maybe I could ask you a follow-up on that, which is that you've also, in that line of work, been visiting Japanese universities and thinking through how they're working on basic and applied research that then, trickles upstream to what actually is getting built. So maybe you could touch on that for just a bit.
So that's a long one, but I'm going to unpack a couple comments, which is, and this comes from a variety of commentators in Japan and elsewhere. Our soft industrial policy of distributed research is actually something that a lot of countries admire and would like to emulate.
Hmm.
And I've had that comment made to me in any number of environments. Like you Americans claim that you don't do industrial policy. Actually, you've been doing it since Vannevar Bush.
Yep.
So give yourself a little more credit. And that's really what's at stake here. And a lot of countries, Japan included, but also others, have looked at ARPA or DARPA or ARPA-E or the NSF or the NIH and said, well, how can I make this work in my environment? How can I induce researchers to work on my problems, right, in my country? So there's a lot that's good, that is worthy of emulation, that has been well studied. And so I've got a lot of questions about that. And also questions saying, well, if your postdocs are having a hard time, I've got a place for them, which on
Hmm.
the one hand is their prerogative. On the other hand, this, as an American, it's not something I really want to hear. I want postdocs working at Berkeley as much as possible. So it stung a little bit as a comment, but maybe acknowledges where we are.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So as we think about the structure of the university, obviously we are right now in a moment where there has been a, shall we say, a rapid and significant departure of federal funding to universities.
Hmm.
But I do think that, all three of us being at Berkeley, being in the university ecosystem for several to many years, we have seen that federal funding is nowhere near covering the majority or enough of research funding at universities. And the sort of restructuring of different universities to accommodate for different lines of funding, whether that's from the private sector, whether that's from philanthropies, that had already started many years ago. And that's something that you, Andrew, and I have to deal with at the lab, is thinking through what does our funding mix look like. So when we think about the challenges that the US faces today in terms of the technology set that we need, thinking about AI, semiconductors, defense tech, climate, and we're also thinking about the funding environments. How do we think about how we structure the university? How do we think about, useful ways to do partnerships? I know our colleagues in some of the AI labs on campus have very interesting partnerships to allow their students to have access to industry compute. I
Yeah.
know that there's a lot of interesting discussions with the US government right now about common compute clouds. How can we think a little bit more creatively about fulfilling our resource needs for basic research in a time when we can be less reliant on a single form of federal funding?
I think I can do that one first, and then I'll let John jump in too. I think one of the things that all universities are having to do, and perhaps where, we're doing a lot of work at Berkeley, is just getting really creative about the various different, effectively, what are natural endowments of the university that are attractive to the marketplace. And so, obviously, being in Silicon Valley, Berkeley and Stanford have long had a history of transitioning companies out of effectively student and faculty labor. And I think one of the things that I've observed on almost 2 decades on campus is that those kind of accelerator programs and foundry type programs have really grown in scope, and so that's all to the good. And obviously, there are other assets that the university enjoys that are useful to the private sector as well, by way of specialized lab equipment, et cetera. So it's almost like that kind of cloud compute in reverse, right? So what are the things that the university has at its disposal across its various different laboratories that are useful to, say, a startup, for example, that isn't going to want to spend the capital initially to buy its own equipment that's incredibly expensive. And so you've seen various different initiatives across Berkeley kind of to get creative in those types of places and thinking about the market. And of course, right, I think the way that we think about funding streams is tripartite across government, corporate, and philanthropy. I will say that, at some point, there are important distinctions between those various different funding vehicles. We ought not to expect private industry to entirely replace all of that basic research money that was coming from the government. Their time horizons are much, much, much shorter, right? They're quarterly, at best, they're annual. And it's just a special company that's thinking 5 years out, 10 years out. And that does tend to be some of the research that comes out of the university in terms of, right, the foundations of the internet, for example. It really is long-term investment before you're getting kind of getting an ROI on that. And so we certainly ought not to be expecting corporations to just entirely come in and replace that. Indeed, I think we need to make a better argument for this power law distribution early TRL level to make sure that the United States government understands what it gets and what it loses as, right, these recalibration efforts take place.
Absolutely. John, do you want to take a stab at
I'd love
this
to
as well?
I'd love to build on that, and I'll question the question a little bit, which is I think there's a can we reframe it in a way such that national governments understand that research autonomy and distributed fragmented research is actually a national priority and a national security priority, and that's really the intent of the article.
Yeah.
Let's question that and say, be careful. You may actually be hurting national competitiveness and national security as well if you're defunding kind of upstream early stage research. Narrowing the response to UC Berkeley, folks on the call might be familiar with Startup Campus, which just came out.
Oh yeah.
I will ask you to point your browser post call to inde.berkeley.edu or startupcampus.berkeley.edu to check it out. INE actually gives a lot of visualizations on how the innovation ecosystem at UC Berkeley has deepened and broadened over the past 25 years. So
Yeah.
I encourage you to check that out. Uh, that sort of gets to necessity being the mother of invention. If you want to, UC Berkeley has a lot of history of dealing with ebbs and flows in funding streams. If we go back to Prop 13 in the late 1970s, the taxpayer revolt, well, that led to less funding coming to the UC system, which led to increased emphasis on federal research, but also working more with the private sector. And so on the one hand, the institution has a lot of history working with ebb and flow in different systems. And so I think that institutional memory and experience will be very useful in this moment. To Andrew's point, really the question is time spans. Foundations have certain time spans, private capital has certain time spans. alumni have certain time spans. And so how do you find what I would call in class founder funder fit, right? The right
Mhm.
form of capital that's thinking on the right time span aligned with the research being done. That's not an easy problem, but I think the institution has a lot of experience dealing with it.
Yeah, no, and I think Berkeley is one of those. I mean, it's something that struck me when I came to Berkeley. Like, Berkeley is much more willing to think about a variety of different funding vehicles than I think some of the more traditional universities that I've had the privilege of engaging with in different capacities. So I do think that's certainly a strong point. I think one of the things we don't talk about necessarily enough is, yes, there are certainly different timelines, and the sort of research that private sector and philanthropy is interested in is probably going to look a little bit different than what we're used to from NSF. But I do want to point out there's also like an administrative change that has to happen. And
Sure.
Andrew, you and I know this all too well. Even the grant vehicles, the sort of contracts that you're looking at, the way in which you have to work through the university to land that money looks very different across those different types of funders. And I've certainly felt that across US universities, we're very much used to the administrivia that comes with federal grants. And there's still some adjusting that needs to be done to easily land some of those private sector and philanthropy pots of money. Andrew, I'm sure you
Absolutely.
can add in on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, universities and Berkeley among them has choices to make about what colors of money that they're willing to accept and for what. And I think it is the case that universities are getting a little bit more creative and accepting broader sways of funds. Just comparing a couple of them. So, for example, the University of California doesn't have a tied university affiliated research and development center in the same way that, say, Carnegie Mellon does or Georgia Tech does for doing, right, really government and national security adjacent work. That is a choice that the University of California and the University of California, Berkeley has made, right? Primarily since after the end of the Cold War. I think that there are some that are more interested in making sure that there's a direct service from the university into that ecosystem, right? Should that be a choice that is made. And so there's all sorts of choices about what colors of money, what types of money, and then you have to build the bureaucracy around, right? Making sure that you're appropriately stewarding that money as well. But obviously there are real conversations at a national level about what the government wants that to look like. I mean, one of the things I'll just note is that in the context of thinking about the United States' role in the world, traditionally there have been research exchanges and research partnerships between a variety of U.S. universities and allies and partners across the globe. So if you're thinking about, right, friendshoring, for example, right, again, universities have a really big role to play if that's something that is deemed to be an acceptable way of kind of channeling funding and research, such that you can have a Berkeley postdoc working on your problem if you're a Japanese university, for example, to use the example that John gave earlier.
Yeah, and I
Well,
think
we'd
one of
love
the
for that to
things,
happen, or
yeah.
more of that, I should say,
Yeah.
or vice versa, right?
No,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think, and John, I know you're familiar with this, we like those postdoc sharing examples are great. But one of the things I really appreciate at Berkeley is you're also seeing that sort of collaboration across the different levels of technology. So Skydeck does a lot of international engagements and working with international startups, bringing them to campus. John, I know that's something you're involved with, if you want to touch on that briefly.
Sure. So Skydeck, for those unfamiliar, is our kind of our official campus accelerator founded in 2012. It was founded by the deans of business and engineering and our IPRA, our head of research. So by definition, it was meant to be multi-department, right? It's meant to serve all of Berkeley, not one department of Berkeley. Berkeley has like 33 or 35 departments. So the idea was, can we have an accelerator that kind of serves the whole school? And it was deliberately put off campus so that the innovators would have access to, but not be on campus premises for a variety of reasons. And so that's now in its 13th year and really has scaled. I'm a mentor. I'm now one of 800 mentors, and it used to be there were like 80. So that's just been up and to the right, and the curve has gone vertical. Internationally, the companies that come tend to be TRL high, not nine. You wouldn't necessarily put it in a space shuttle, but maybe eight, maybe
Yeah.
seven. Right, but mature who are coming to get access to the Berkeley acceleration method, meet the mentors, increase their chances of attracting private capital in the Bay Area, for example. So a variety of incentives. And so Berkeley has worked with a lot of international institutional partners, or I should say Skydeck has, ITRI in Taiwan, Jetra in Japan, institutions in Armenia, Sweden, a bunch of others. So a lot of international innovation agencies have said this is something that can help me at home, which is really interesting. And so it's helping Berkeley by having people come here. It's also helping a lot of other countries kind of further their innovation ecosystems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also helping Berkeley by being the front line of some of the engagements with VCs. That's
Yep.
Absolutely.
something that I want to turn to because obviously we have VCs engaging with Skydeck and those other accelerators. But one of the things that gets brought up in UPs is the possible role of venture capitalism in the double power law. So I do want to give you a chance to talk about that. John, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So I'll give you a two-part answer, which is first pick up on the Skydeck thread and then that which is in the article. So Skydeck, there is a Skydeck fund, which is separate from Skydeck. It invests in the cohort track of Skydeck, so about 40 companies a year. They get $200,000 checks. It converts to about 7% of the company. So it really has to be at the right stage, the right founder. If you're more
Mhm.
mature, it doesn't make sense. And so they want to invest and vice versa. So that exists. And there are venture capital firms that actually invest in the fund or invest in companies that come out. And some that say, actually, I want to get in before Skydeck. And so they'll go direct to campus and try and find, the next Jan Stoika, for example, or maybe Jan Stoika students. So there's that interaction with the venture capital community through Skydeck and other touch points on campus. And then the second part, and the part we talked about in the article, which is really the question of would venture capital move upstream to
Yep.
fund more core research? And I would say no, and for a few simple reasons. One, venture capital funds raise from LPs. So these are institutions, they might be universities, they might be endowments, they might be private companies from a variety of, and so they're supposed to deliver a rate of return each year.
Hmm.
And those institutions also invest in other things, whether it's REITs or bonds or whatever it is. And so venture capital is supposed to provide consistent returns. So something that takes longer and has higher beta outcomes is probably not something the venture capital firm would move upstream to do. The time span doesn't match a venture capital fund. The venture capital fund is supposed to be 10 years in duration. Most of the capital is deployed in the first 3 years, and then there's 7 years of kind of support. That's gotten a little bit longer recently because companies are staying private longer. Stripe is still private, amazingly,
Hmm.
right? And so what was a 10-year vehicle is becoming 12 years, becoming 13 year, and that's an issue between the funds and their LPs. But even then, it doesn't match, right, the needs of long-term core research. Rather, venture capital really is best deployed as something that amplifies something that's been, for lack of a better word, incubated,
Yeah.
maybe gotten to a proof of concept, a breadboard on a bench, and then the venture capital firm can like pour in capital and say, okay, this is the commercial path, this is not the commercial path, right? So I don't think venture capital firms would move upstream. Foundations might, right? But that's a little bit different answer to your question.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I add to that is that one of the things that has been useful for basic research coming out of the VC ecosystem, not the VCs themselves, but
Mhm.
think, for example, their leadership, their investors, has been an appreciation, particularly on deep tech. So those technologies that have dual use potential to effectively be inside of the private donor pool that then subsequently supports basic research by virtue of the salaries that they're drawing, right, the returns that they're getting. And so that's an important piece of the puzzle. So the VC ecosystem is more than just the funds themselves
Sure.
in terms of the returns that they're generating. And certainly one of the things that we've observed, so think of institutions like Shield Capital, for example, who are kind of new types of VCs that are operating in this deep tech space, and then subsequently thinking hard about their general support for the ecosystem as well. And that's ended up proving really important to your various different startups across the ecosystem, whether it be Anduril, any number of the space startups, Maxar Planet, and Apex and others. So yeah, there's a lot of what our colleague at the information school, Anno Sixtini, and Red describes as agglomeration effects of the valley, and that's an important piece of the puzzle.
I've got regional advantage behind me on my
Yeah,
desk here. You're right. So
yeah,
for trivia buffs out there. So, but I'll append a little bit to what you said, which is even those funds. So if you're Shield or you know um, Paladin,
yeah,
other Crosslink has kind of a defense practice. So even those have to say to their LPs
yeah.
what they're investing in and why. And there's a governance document that says we're going to invest in this, we're not going to invest in that. So there's still fund LP agreement on what's an accepted topic area. And so a specific fund like Shield, which is really for the purpose of investing in dual use technology, has agreement from its LPs, from its funders,
Yep.
and understanding. So there, it's a bespoke vehicle that's been formed for that purpose. Where if you're an existing fund and then you're going to move upstream to core research, or you're going to move to middle use, you still have to kind of go through that process of getting to agreement with your LP. So you're going to do so.
Yeah.
Just before I go into my next question, I do want to say that we will start to open this up to question and answer. So if you have any questions that you would like me to pose to our panelists, please do use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. So I do want to touch on the fact, so even if there's, slim chances of venture capital coming in and funding basic research, I do think that there's a communication role that venture capitalists and the private sector can play, particularly in communicating the importance of the basic research ecosystem to government. And that's something that I was happy to see throughout the spring and early summer. There were certainly those in the private sector trying to remind the administration of the importance of basic research funding to universities, of the role that international students play in the US research ecosystem. So I would just love to hear thoughts on how we can better engage partners with the understanding that they might not solve the funding gap, but they do have a role to play in advocating for the value add of US universities.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think one of the things is really, I mean, at its most basic, the article is arguing that the VCs are already cognizant in our view, right? But ought to be cognizant and communicate where it is the products, the people that they're investing in ultimately come from, which is from, right, lower TRL. And so if you get rid of all of the support for lower TRL activities, there's going to be nothing for the VC community to actually engage on when they get to TRL 7, 8. And so, that's going to be a really important piece of the puzzle here, as we kind of move forward.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up a comment, and actually, this is a Scott Cooper quote. So, folks familiar with Scott Cooper, he was employee number 3 at Andreessen Horowitz. He's now actually at OPM, seconded to the administration, and I have his Secrets of Sand Hill Road up behind me. And he will describe venture capital as a people business, and he's not unique in saying that. A lot of venture capitalists will say that it's really about finding the person most likely to solve a problem that other people probably see too.
Yep.
So why you? Given that 10 other people or 20 other people around the world probably are cognizant that this problem exists, you're really trying to de-risk the probability that a given person, a given founder is going to be the one who solves it, because you're only betting on one. Like as a fund, you can really only pick one founder in a given category. At least you should. Thus, if venture capital is a people business, you want the best people working on those problems. And this gets to the communication question.
Yeah.
Right? You want people being attracted to universities to work on hard problems. You want people doing postdoc research. The venture capital industry has a stake in that, right? Having the best, brightest people attracted working on hard problems that later get amplified. If those researchers decide to either spin the research out or the research strands are made available through a TLO. So if it's a people problem, you don't want to narrow the flow of people. Like it's not existential, but it's, I'd say, harmful if you don't have the best and brightest always working on the hardest problems. So carrying that message, I think, is very important for both for institutions, for universities, but also for the venture capital industry.
Yeah.
And it's also how we structure our formation programmings at universities. I feel like Berkeley has really made the effort over the past few years to develop the classes and programs to graduate undergrad and graduate students in STEM who are also formed in, basic business, the Changemaker series from Rich Lyons. Obviously, you, John, and some of your other colleagues at the business school have these classes that teach more engineering-based students how to think about commercialization and all of that. So there's things that we can do as a university to better position our students for those roles, and then we do get those follow-on returns. So maybe we could turn to that, and once again, a plug for any questions from the audience, but turn to what we can do as an institution to improve our chances at continuing the basic research that we should be doing as a university. How can we better translate those results to policymakers to increase that funding flow? and how can we make sure that we're still advocating for those sorts of middle of the innovation pipeline areas that are still very important, like applied research and translating research.
So there was a few things in there. I'm going to pick up on a prior one first, which is current Berkeley students, whether grad or undergrad, have a good problem to have, which is a navigability problem. There's just so much going on campus
Yeah.
to help you learn how to innovate, commercialize an innovation. You can speed run the campus in creative ways, and there's actually a discovery problem, which is a better problem to have than having under-resourced the problem. So in that sense, Berkeley's done a lot. It's sort of federated, so students will come to me and say, well, I'm not sure where to start. And I frame it as a good problem to have. There's a lot of ways that if you're someone who's thinking about a problem or commercializing, there's a lot of resources you can avail yourself to on campus. And so just how to discover that. A funny case study I share in class, the founder of EditPep, right? The EditPep case study is a CRISPR researcher at the Innovative Genomics Institute who just happened to see an email at the right time saying that there's a life sciences entrepreneurship center on campus that's kind of willing to help him speed run commercialization classes, helping with translation of research into commercial companies. Had he not checked the email, maybe he wouldn't have applied. Right. So that sort of problem is a good problem to have, but the campus is doing really a lot, right, to try and get researchers to think, well, what if I spun this out? Right. And those are all, if you're a current student, if you're undergrad, if you're an MBA, whatever department you're in, you can work on those projects and it's awesome. It doesn't have to be your career, but you can get a lot of different experiences supporting researchers in those projects. So that's a good problem to have. The more direct answer to your immediate question, a little bit of telling the story, and Chancellor Lyons has talked about this, that we probably need to do a little bit job telling our story as an institution. Researchers' stories need to be better told. I found it really interesting that the directors of Sandia Lab, Lawrence Livermore, and Los Alamos all consented to speak to The Economist about their research.
Yeah.
They're choosing to tell their story. Well, why tell their story now? Because clearly some people need to hear the story, right? So I do think there's a bit of a storytelling solution to the problem. That's why Andrew and I really wanted to speak to the national security, national competitive aspects of this, right? If you're defunding research, you're actually going to hurt national competitiveness and potentially national security, and that's not a problem anyone wants to have.
Yeah, and just to pull on that thread a little bit, I mean, the University of California, for two of those three labs that you mentioned, John, plays a key role in the management.
Right?
And
And people don't know that.
exactly. Well, even some of our faculty might not have necessarily known that until Oppenheimer came out, well, almost a year ago now. And that's a major success story because again, different institutions play a different role across this innovation stack. And again, there's definitely basic research at low TRL that are happening inside of the national laboratories, but they're also, right, making a lot of hay of doing the investment and helping technologies and people get over the valley of death, right? So TRLs 4 through 6, where a lot of good ideas actually potentially die on the vine. And so that's one of the major roles that they play. And so, I mean, I think in reality, the answer to your question, Leah, is just more creativity. And an acceptance of the fact that, it is a different environment that is akin to the challenges that we faced, gosh, 50 years ago now, around the funding environment. But really, like I said, at its very base, what John and I were trying to do was to make it very clear that you have this power law that we're almost entirely ignoring in basic research, and that actually is what precipitates all of the laudatory commentary that we have about just make the VC companies, right? Because similarly to John, when I go abroad, right, and say, I'm based in Silicon Valley, they say, oh, I mean, we've seen examples of this, right? So, I mean, not to pick on France, right, but Silicon on the Seine, and Silicon Roundabout in London. So a lot of trying to copy, right, this ecosystem, and it's really, really hard to do that. And we laud it, and people want to copy it, but it really does, right, build upon this very broad set of resources that are given to a very broad set of researchers across the country that then, right, end up having outsized impacts on the broader innovation economy.
Absolutely. And, it's something that we frequently talk about, well, all three of us with international partners, is the scale of US universities is just not something that you see elsewhere. the
Yeah.
scale of the R&D. It's just incredibly difficult to replicate. But I think what's been made abundantly clear over the summer is that it's a very resource intensive ecosystem that is not operating on particularly high profit margins or any profit margins at all.
Yeah.
So it is, I mean, I do think it's worth, in the last few minutes, just thinking a bit about the real vulnerabilities of the system that we've had to reckon with over the past summer. Like, this is not a system that's necessarily built for robustness in the face of financial withdrawal. And so I think it's important, as much as we laud that basic research ecosystem, to acknowledge how frail it is once you start pulling funding from it. Labs don't really have credit that they can pull if they run out of money. Postdocs, once they're no longer paid for, they can't really be pulled back
Industry.
in 6 months later. So maybe Andrew, you could start with that. And
Yeah, gosh, I mean, there's so much to say there. I spent a decent portion of my career inside the national laboratories, and one of the things that there was widespread recognition of was the need to fail fast and fail often and to be allowed to fail. And that is a very difficult thing to do with taxpayer funds. And I think a piece of the story is much better to fail with hundreds of thousands of dollars with a PI in a university laboratory and five postdocs rather than, right, companies that have a market cap of, right, tens of millions of dollars. And that's really what universities are providing. They're providing the opportunity to fail, fail fast, and then go on, move on to the next thing, and understand that, right? Yes, we are going to have failures in the same way that VC portfolio companies have failures, but the unicorns, right, are going to make up for, right, those failures. And so we've never really kind of conceptualized basic research and the ways in which programs are seeded by, RPE, ARPA-H, NSF in that way. But that really is what we're doing. And out of that, you get mRNA, you get, right, orbit transit technology in space, right? You get all of the very different microsatellite material science advances. And so, I think that's definitely a piece of the story too.
absolutely.
Yeah, I want to double
John, do
click
you
on
want?
there's a point. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
an interesting point packed in there, which is and so my students, I have a few on the call who will hear more about this. There are really two valleys of death. There's technological and commercial, and universities can help solve the former, which is you prove it can be done. You have an N of one. It worked in the lab. It worked on the bench, and that's a different level of readiness than something that's scalable, shippable, right? And hopefully has a hockey stick growth model. So there are really two, and universities help a lot with the former. And so that's an important message to convey is you want people working in, as Andrew pointed out, it's kind of low cost for risk to have a PI and a couple postdocs trying something and proving it like an N of one. All right.
Hmm.
Version, like proof that this can be done. And then how do we take that and scale that? Do we continue research? Do we spin it out? Do we commercialize it? That's a different decision. But you need that first research to happen in order to have the second decision happen.
Yeah.
Great. So we have some questions from the audience. So thank you for putting those in. So to start, as US immigration policy remains unpredictable and subject to rapid change, how is the US innovation ecosystem impacted by that? And that's something that we've seen throughout the course of the past 7 months now.
Yeah. I mean, I can take it further. There was a massive, right, H-1B debate, the Valley in particular, but also Boston, DMV, Metro, New York, right, benefit from H-1B visas and the kind of high skill sets that are brought in. I think it's one of my bugbears has long been that, in the United States, we give our students effectively a year to find somebody who's willing to pay tens of thousands of dollars to keep them, which is nonsensical. A lot of our wonderful trained masters and PhD students end up having to either return home or go somewhere else, which is not doing anything for our tech competitiveness. Hopefully helping out friends and partners, but definitely not helping out ourselves. That said, other countries do it even worse. In the United Kingdom, they've got like 2 weeks, not a year. So I think that immigration policy is competitiveness policy. We just don't think about it that way. And so, that's one of the things that, I push on in quite a lot of the meetings that I have. And in terms of the kind of the second part of the question there around kind of like diversity of background driving innovation, that's the story of the Valley's success. And obviously, like John said, he's got regional advantage behind him. If you're interested in that, read Anno's book, because it really does make clear the degree to which you had all sorts of sharing of effectively R&D processes between various different individuals coming out of different companies that I'm sure that the company executives wish were not being shared, but were being shared usually in pubs down in Palo Alto. And so, right, that's where a lot of really good ideas come from, right? It is the crosstalk inside of this ecosystem. And again, we're not the only place that does it, right? Like Austin does it, Boston does it. But here we have a long history of doing it very well. Yeah.
I'm happy to pick that up, which is if you think, I said earlier, venture capital is a people business, so too is research, right? You really do want the best and brightest people working. So if you narrow that spigot, you limit the time which a person can stay post graduation. That's broadly harmful. And we've already seen the decline in international applicants, say at the grad student level.
Hmm.
Thankfully, now the MBA is a STEM degree, which gives you 3 years to hang out as opposed to the shorter period that it was in the 2010s. Um, that said, California is a subnational actor. We don't have our own visa policy as much as we wish we might. And so, we have to exist within a national immigration or visa framework. So thankfully, at least the institution has been creative about how do we get students incentives and give them a way to stay longer post graduation so they can find their footing and hopefully stay, right? And that has broadly been to the benefit of the Bay Area for decades.
Yeah, and part of that has also been, being administratively available to respond to quick changes. I think
Right.
US universities got a lot of unexpected surprises throughout the spring, and part of where we saw, successful overturning of visa revocations were when, resources were put in place at the right time with a lot of alacrity to be able to push back. And so I think universities should probably be prepared for more of the same. But it drives into another question we've gotten from the audience, which is the potential exodus of scientists and researchers from the US, which both of you have alluded to.
Yeah.
It does at the end really impact our ability to maintain highly skilled individuals in our innovation ecosystem. I don't know if either of you wants to comment more on the exodus question.
Yeah, we're observing it. Other countries are very clever in terms of providing funding for researchers or regulatory sandboxes in the case. I mean, obviously, the place that we're all looking at this right now is in artificial intelligence technologies. And so countries like the UAE being pretty opportunistic in terms of picking off American talent and offering them, right, lots and lots of money and a lot of freedom to operate in the way that they would wish. In the past, we've got other examples from cloning where the Chinese did the same, where they pulled a lot of American researchers who were told they cannot do their work here, to other locales, and so this is all happening on a global basis now. The number of US universities in the top 100 is just orders of magnitude greater than any other country, although China's now rising in those numbers too. So it's not as if like all American researchers are going to find somewhere to go. But countries around the world, if they're clever, all right, are paying very close attention to this.
And there's any number of countries that are, looking at this opportunistically as they should,
Yeah.
right? So there was a member of Haas faculty who went on service back to the German Economic Ministry and, basically saw this as a moment for Germany to regain maybe some of what it lost in the 30s and 40s. So not a happy comparison, but still, right? And it's not just the researchers who are here, but the researchers who don't come, right? For whatever
Mhm.
reason, they're like, it's just not worth it, the stress or whatever it is. And that's probably not helpful, right? So that's
Yeah.
about all. I don't have data to say is there an exodus or not yet. Right
As
now.
active efforts for sure.
What's that?
My French colleagues like to remind me that if I was back in Europe, I would have a bit more vacation.
There's a quality of life argument.
They are,
Not
I mean,
nothing.
yeah, no, it's probably better that our allies pick up someone who's leaving than others, but it's still like a real question for the US innovation ecosystem.
Absolutely.
But with that, I do think that we're getting close to time. So I want to thank both of you for your time and for joining me with this conversation. I want to thank all those of you in the audience who joined us this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions, for giving us your time. We will do more of these webinars, so we encourage you to keep an eye on the BRSL website. You can sign up for our newsletter to be notified about new events. I very much encourage you to go read Andrew and John's piece and War on the Rocks, and I would encourage you to go read all the other reading recommendations so kindly provided by John. John, we really need to get a reading list from you at some point and post it on
Okay,
the websites.
it
John
shall
also
be
has a
so.
Substack, so definitely go read John's Substack. But yeah, with that, you should know where to find us. Drop us a line. We're always happy to talk about these issues, and I hope everyone has a very nice rest of their day. Thanks both for joining me.
Thank you for having
Perfect.
me.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks, John.
Thank you.